All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think most of you have been admitted to the chat or to the video. I would like to welcome you, everyone, to this first virtual book launch. We are making history for the Pretoria University Law Press, and I want to thank you very much for joining us this afternoon to launch this beautiful, let me just see where I have to zoom, this beautiful manuscript as part of the PULP family. Before we proceed, let me just introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gustav Muller. I am a staff member at the University of Pretoria, but for purposes of this afternoon, I think it's more important to mention that I'm a member of the editorial board of PULP, and I was privileged to be the shepherd for this book that shepherded through the editorial or the peer review process. So thank you very much for everyone who is joining us again. Before we proceed, and thank you very much for also recording this, I would like to alert everyone to the fact that we are live streaming this virtual book launch on the Facebook page of the Center for Human Rights, as well as the Facebook page for the Pretoria University Law Press. So this session is being live recorded, and it will be available after the session or on completion of the session on the Facebook pages that I mentioned, as well as the PULP website. So I would encourage you to please go visit those Facebook pages after we are done, like the video if you enjoyed the virtual launch, and perhaps share it with colleagues or friends or people you know that might be interested in this book. So before we proceed, let me introduce the panel to you, this just very briefly. It's a great honor and privilege for me to introduce our panel. Our first panelist will be Professor Charles FOMBAD. He is the chair of the Pretoria University Law Press, and he will speak very briefly to us about PULP in general. Then our second speaker is Judge Kalapan, who is a judge of the Pretoria High Court, the Gauteng Division of the High Court. Thank you very much, Judge Kalapan, for joining us. We unfortunately do not have Professor de Schutter's recording available to us. He's currently on leave and said he couldn't make it to the launch after all. So after Judge Kalapan, we will ask Professor Liebenberg to speak on her, to share her thoughts about the book and perhaps make a few links for us on the theme of poverty and human rights. After that, we will give the floor to our editors of this beautiful book, Professor Durojaye and Ms. Mirugi-Mukundi. I think Ms. Mukundi will speak on behalf of both the editors of the book. Then we would give an opportunity to Professor Ntlama, who is also an author. I think he wrote the chapter on equality. And then our last speaker is Dr. Nkrumah, that will wrap up perhaps the first hour of proceedings. After that, we will have a panel discussion, or we will open up the floor where people from the audience can ask questions. But when we get there, I will speak about the housekeeping rules that will apply there. For the moment, the housekeeping rules is please just keep your microphone muted. I think everyone is already adhering to that. And if your internet connection is strong enough, please feel free to switch on your video. But you are obviously welcome to switch your video off for the moment. So I think without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor FOMBAD to just speak to us very in general terms about PULP and what we do. Thank you, Professor FOMBAD, for joining us, and the floor is yours now. Perhaps just before Professor
Thank you very
FOMBAD
much,
speaks,
Chair.
Professor FOMBAD, sorry for interrupting you there. We have posted a poll on the screen for you. You are welcome to answer those questions in the poll at your own leisure while Professor FOMBAD speaks, and then listen attentively to him. Thank you very much. Sorry for that, Professor FOMBAD.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Muller. Honorable Judge Jody Colapen, distinguished panelists, participants at this virtual book launch, good afternoon. On behalf of the Pretoria University Law Press, I would like to warmly welcome you to this book launch. We thank you very much indeed for finding time in your busy schedules to participate in this event. At a time when the levels of poverty and human rights violations in Africa have been aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic, there could be no better time to launch this book. We at PULP are proud to have come out with such a topical book, but let me take this opportunity to thank the two editors, Professor Ebenezer Durojaye and Mrs. Gladys Mirugi-Mukundi, and their collaborators for their excellent book. They will tell you more about the book in just a while. For my part, I want the audience to know that we in the Faculty of Law, University of Pretoria, and more specifically at PULP, have been publishing books like this for the past 15 years, although we don't launch them as often as we should do. Although our focus this afternoon is on the launch of this book, and my task is simply to welcome you, let me take this opportunity to tell you a few things about PULP. PULP is an independent press based in the Center for Human Rights at the Faculty of Law, University of Pretoria. PULP was established in 2005 to address the problem of the shortage of indigenous legal material in Africa. Our primary mission is to promote legal scholarship by increasing access to innovative, high-quality, peer-reviewed texts on Africa. PULP is a registered publisher with the Publishers Association of South Africa, which is the largest publishing industry body in South Africa, and all the material goes through strict peer reviews to ensure accreditation and high-quality output. It is registered with the Directory of Open Access Books database. Besides English, we have published in other languages such as Afrikaans, Arabic, French, Swahili, and Portuguese. All our books are available online in electronic format at no charge. As a result, we pay no royalties to authors. We publish 5 journals: the African Human Rights Law Journal, the De Jure Law Journal, the Pretoria Student Law Review, the African Disability Rights Yearbook, and the African Human Rights Yearbook. And of these, 4 are fully open access journals online. Besides the journals, we have published over 240 books. We have agreements with iGo Books to sell print-on-demand copies from their website, and they also have the liaison with Blue Weaver Distribution, which is the distributor to all major bookshops such as Exclusive Books. PULP has a strong social presence and is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. All manuscripts are submitted for publication and are reviewed by an editorial board which consists of myself, Professor Christoph Hens, Professor Franz Filion, Dr. Gustav Muller, Professor Seppo Malingosi, Dr. Martha Bradley, and Professor Magnus Kilander. From its very beginning in 2005, PULP has been very competently and professionally managed by Mrs. Lizette Herman, who has made it grow from strength to strength. She is assisted by Ms. Lizel Hager in marketing and our very good friend Sydney Madlope, who is in charge of the bookstore. I have been privileged to be part of PULP since 2010. I would not want to miss any opportunity to acknowledge those who came up with the PULP idea and whose foresight, dedication, and hard work has made PULP what it is today. And here I'm referring to the three founders of PULP, Professors Christoph Hens, Franz Furion, and Professor Danny Brown. I should also add that Mrs. Lizette Herman was also there at the very beginning. We will never cease to thank them enough for giving us PULP. Chair, we have a distinguished panel, and I guess we all want to hear them, and even more importantly, hear what this book is all about. Let me end once again by thanking each and everyone for joining us today in this very important event. I hope that you will enjoy it and will be enriched by the presentations. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor FOMBAD, for your thank you words, as well as your overview of PULP and where it's come from and what we've already achieved. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Judge Kalapan, as I mentioned before, who is a judge in the Gauteng Division of the High Court here in Pretoria, to speak in general terms to us about the book. Thank you, Judge Kalapan, once again for joining us. If you'll just remember to switch on your microphone, I will happily hand over to you. Thank you, sir.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Muller, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this launch this afternoon. I must just point out that after my term of office at the Human Rights Commission ended in late 2009, I took a post at the University of Pretoria as a lecturer, but I was only able to discharge those duties for 3 months, 2.5 months of which was the vacation, when I started acting as a judge in January. So I think the students were spared having me unleashed on them. And but at the same time, I have a long association with the university, including the faculty and the Center for Human Rights, and some of the institutions there, like the Center for Child Law. And I just want to say that the work done by certainly the law faculty and the institutions that I've referred to is really groundbreaking. When I look at developments in the area of child law, then there's little doubt that we would have never made the kind of strides we've made in that area without the sterling work by those who established and continued to run that center. And that's just one example. There are many others, including the moot court competition. And I want to pay tribute to the leadership of the university. And I see Professor Gustav Muller is on the list of participants, and just to say hello to him. So without further ado, let me make a few remarks. I don't like to make long speeches, and I've been through the book briefly, but I can't claim that I've read it. And so I want to make some general remarks around poverty. And let me start by saying that the human condition of poverty is not a matter of destiny or divinity. People don't choose to be poor, but others make choices that result in poverty. And it's very often the powerful and the resourced, whether they are governments or whether they are non-state actors, who through their conduct, through the policies they put in place, often done in the name of the law, systematically and incrementally results in the exclusion and the deprivation that billions across the world experience. And a large percentage of those people live on our continent, where depressingly the number of people who live in poverty has not decreased, but increased. So poverty is a problem for humanity. And it shouldn't be a problem because there are enough resources on this planet, whether it be land, food, water, energy, technology, to enable all of humanity to live in dignity and free of poverty. And yet it persists doggedly, suggesting that declarations of intent, human rights frameworks, development goals, while all of them are critically important and relevant in the fight against poverty, lose their force when they're not accompanied by the necessary political will to give effect to what they stand for. And one need to go no further than look at the UNDP declaration in 1995, when it was observed that we live in a world that is characterized by a breathtaking globalization of prosperity, side by side with a depressing globalization of poverty. Those remarks 25 years ago remain relevant today, and if anything, that divide has increased. Simply by way of example, in South Africa, we are told no less than 12 million people go to bed hungry every night. And that was before the onset of COVID. And yet as a country, we have enough food and resources to provide for all our people. So it's not a resource problem. It's how those resources are allocated and distributed and the entitlements to those resources. The publication has an interesting statistic that Oxfam produced in its 2018 report, where they indicate quite alarmingly that 26 of the wealthiest people on the planet have the same amount of worth financially as some 3.8 billion people across the world. Now, if one translates that roughly, it means that one of those 26 people owns as much as 146 million people own collectively. Now that's done legally, and it's in that context that we have to develop strategies to fight poverty. So poverty is just not about illegal conduct, and it's just not about corruption. It's about often what happens in the name of the law and validated and supported and endorsed by the law. And so we celebrate democracies in South Africa, and we celebrate democracies across the world. And democracy has become the kind of mantra to sell to people, to say, well, this is the way to a better life. And while the entitlements that come with democracy and the rights that are regarded as inalienable, whether they're about free and fair elections, free expression, a free media, are important in their own right. But increasingly, people ask the question, the relevant question and the poignant question, how does this result in a transformation of our lives? And if that question can't be answered in the affirmative, then understandably, people may say, validly so, that democracy has failed to deliver on its outcomes. Because I don't believe people go to vote simply for the sake of voting, particularly in the developing world, and particularly in countries that come out of repression and oppression like ours. People go to vote in order to secure an improvement in the quality of life, to give their children a future, to provide for their education, to provide for a condition of life that is consistent with dignity. And certainly in South Africa, the adoption of the 1994 Constitution that came as a result of a political compromise that some regarded as a fatal compromise, carried within it the promise of a better life for all. And the text of the Constitution speaks of a commitment to unlock and to free the potential of each person. And so people were entitled to see that as something transformative and something that would deliver as a promissory note to a better future. And when that doesn't happen, then I don't think it's fair to ask people to defend the Constitution. And we often look at people and criticize them when they don't act in accordance with the Constitution. And we say, well, you're acting unconstitutionally. But it must raise the question, when the Constitution fails to deliver, then can it continue to demand fidelity to it? And I know that's a controversial statement I make, but in the lives of ordinary people, it becomes real, that if I am called upon to defend a democracy, then I must be able to defend something that is defensible and that means something in my life. And if truth be told, millions of people across the world live outside of the promises of the constitutions that prevail in their countries. And so I think that's a challenge for us, just not in South Africa, but across Africa, that it can't be that democracy can be sustainable in the face of such deep poverty and in the face of such stark exclusion. the last 3 or 4 months, if anybody has doubt about the levels of poverty in our society, the evidence would stare you in your face. Not that it hasn't been there for as long as I can remember, but the sight of people simply reaching stages of desperation in a society that has so much must say to us that it's not sustainable to continue with a model of democracy that is able to somehow legally justify such levels of differentiation, exclusion, and marginalization. So let me move on to the brief discussion around poverty as a human rights issue. And I know there's a long debate around this, and I may not be as steeped in the expertise and in the current debates, but all the manifestations of poverty constitute a violation of one or the other right. Whether it's a lack of education, whether it's a lack of access to food or to water or to social security or to healthcare. And so those manifestations, all of them individually and collectively, constitute a violation of one or other right. But yet the condition of poverty as a whole is not regarded as a human rights violation. And I know that Professor Thomas Pocher has written a book, Freedom from Poverty, I think, as a human right. And I think there probably is a need for a continuing debate. If there has been, then I apologize because I haven't kept up to date with regard to whether poverty in itself should constitute a human rights violation. And there must be a compelling argument for that to be so, in particular, if every manifestation of poverty would be a violation of human rights. And in that regard, I think Professor Thomas Pocher makes an interesting observation and a bit of a caution when he says, and I just want to read what he says in his book. Sorry, I'll find it now. This is what he says, and this is not a general critique of human rights frameworks and human rights declarations. I think they're important, but I think we shouldn't take sort of comfort in the fact that they're there, but rather how they are able to transform the promises they make and to convert them into reality. But this is what he says, and I think it's a lesson and a message for human rights actors, but for all across the world. He says, when they are vague and fuzzy, proclamations of human rights easily become a substitute for real progress. Great battles are fought and glorious victories are won over rhetorical details that in the end make precious little difference to the real world. People used to say that it is awful, regrettable, or troubling that so many children go to bed hungry and so many mothers must watch their children die from diarrhea or some other cheaply treatable disease. Today, we are more likely to say that the poor have a human right to basic necessities, or even that their basic rights are violated. This change in language appeals to many of us, as we can now picture the poor not as shrunken wretches begging for our help, but as persons with dignity who are claiming what is theirs by right. But it is still only a new form of words, a rhetorical triumph, one in a long series of paper victories. And so I think that should leave us with much to ponder about. And I'm not suggesting that the standard setting in the last 60 years has not been remarkable, and I'm not suggesting that it hasn't led to real change in many parts of our world, including ours. But I think the point that he makes is that if it is only a paper victory, then it means very little. And it's just a change of language and a change of words. And it's about how the paper victory can be converted into a real victory and into a meaningful victory, into a sustainable victory that changes the lives of people in a real way. And so at the launch of this publication, I think the matter of the strategies that we adopt to overcome poverty occupy center place. And before just discussing those briefly, I think it's necessary to understand that poverty persists because structurally we have structured our world and our society in a way that allows it to persist, and indeed encourages its persistence, because there are those who don't have an interest in ending poverty, and structurally, and they have the power to influence the kind of structure of the world we live in. And one sees this all the time. You see, as a sitting judge, the National Credit Act is passed in order to provide equity and justice for those who apply for and receive credit. And yet invariably credit providers are at the forefront of seeking interpretations of the law and enforcing the law in a manner that was totally not foreseen or intended by Parliament. The Extension of Security of Tenure Act, for example, was intended to protect and secure tenure for those living on farms. And yet in its enforcement, those people for whom the law was intended hardly benefit from it. And the enforcement is really driven by those who continue to hold the power and the influence. So even in a democracy, and even the best intended laws and even the best crafted laws still fall short because of the power dynamics and the structure in our society. And so we need to not be too romantic about the wonderful laws and the wonderful constitution, but interrogate on an ongoing basis whether they do what they were intended to do. And so human rights actors have embraced and embarked on a number of strategies to overcome and to deal with poverty. And they're all valuable in their own right. Litigation is one of them, and I see this all the time. But again, in the last 25 years, there's been substantial and considerable litigation around socioeconomic rights, and it's made a real difference. But is it, not because of the fault of those who litigate, but again because of the way in which the system operates, likely to make massive inroads into the landscape of poverty? I don't think so. I think and Sandra Liebenberg may have something different to say on this, when we look at the manner in which the jurisprudence has developed, then all that governments need to do is satisfy the test of reasonableness, satisfy the test of rationality, for example, be able to show that their deployment of resources was reasonable, to be able to say, well, we've discharged our socioeconomic rights obligations in terms of the Constitution. And important as these judgments are, we also must recognize that courts are inherently conservative, that the principle of separation of powers acts as a serious and important barrier in terms of the boundaries of judicial power. And as Professor Carl Clare has also reminded us, that courts and judges are generally conservative, maybe not necessarily politically, but jurisprudentially. So all those act as constraints in terms of how much litigation can do. Then the campaign around fighting corruption is an important one, and I think no one can doubt that corruption has an impact on poverty. But I dare say that the focus on corruption, important as it is, has taken our mind off, as it were, the structural fault lines in the society that allows poverty to persist. Because even if we're able to, and it's impossible, I think, live in a corruption-free society, that's not going to bring about the end of poverty. That doesn't mean we must not fight corruption. It's persistent, and it's at the core of a society, and it undermines the entire ethical basis on which we live, and that's important. But we shouldn't dare think that a victory over corruption will end poverty. It won't. But we also should not see the poor and those who live in poverty as victims who don't have agency. And I think the manner in which poor people have organized themselves, just not in South Africa, but across the world, and have articulated their demands and have mobilized the limited resources they have, and have used the law, and in some cases acted outside of the law to advance their interests, is an important one, and one that should be recognized as well. But ultimately, I think that unless one begins to seriously examine the need for deep structural changes in our society, then all attempts to deal with poverty may well fall short of truly transforming the society and making meaningful changes in the patterns of poverty and exclusion. And therein lies the difficulty, because it's at that level that the most resistance will be, and it's at that point that one is able to see who your friends are and who your enemies are. And lots of well-meaning people and middle-class people in South Africa will say, yes, we want to be part of the fight against poverty. But I think if you say to people, well, we need to make serious structural changes in our society, and we need to look at what people earn, and why should a judge and someone who cleans the courthouse have such a massive disparity in their incomes? That's when I suppose you will know where the fault lines lies and where the battles have to be fought. And I don't want to suggest that that's going to be an easy task, and I don't want to even predict that that will be a task that will, a battle that will be won. But it's at that level that I think we can only hope, if those kind of changes are advanced, that we can really change the architecture of our society and the fault lines that enable poverty to persist. And so as I come to my conclusion, Dr. Muller, let me recall a visit I made some 20 years ago, I think, to a little village deep in Skokuni land. It was called Khapasha. And at that stage, I worked at the Human Rights Commission, and I spoke to the village people. I was accompanied by Commissioner Tom Mantata, and Tom Mantata died recently. It took us about 5 hours to get there, and we got to this village that was really desolate and bereft of resources. And so it was our task to address the villagers about human rights. And we spoke, and I suppose people looked at us with some bewilderment. And after we'd spoken, an elderly villager got up and he said, I thank you for your talk, Mr. Collopin. I enjoyed listening to you, and you spoke with great passion about this thing you call human rights. But when I look at you, and I look at the car you came with, and I look at the way you're dressed, and it's clear to me also that this thing you call human rights has really worked for you in your life. And forgive me for saying this, but maybe that's why you speak about it with such great passion. And I do apologize if I'm not as passionate as you are about it, but I can assure you that if it works for me half as well as it has worked for you, then I will be even more passionate about it than you are. And I thought that was a fair comment to make, that this thing that we speak about almost as a gospel, human rights, it's important. It is what many of us believe is an important tool in how we transform society. But unless it works for ordinary people, and people have been extremely patient, then people will not feel as passionate about it as some of us do, and people will not defend it, and you wouldn't blame them for not defending it when it comes under attack. So let me conclude by commending PULP on this publication, the editors, the contributors, and say that I think it's an important contribution to perhaps the most pressing issue that faces humanity, just not now, but for the long foreseeable future. So thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Judge Collopin. Thank you very much for placing, for your contextual remarks about poverty and alerting us to the multidimensional ways in which people suffer discrimination on this indirect ground. Thank you also very much for reminding us of the interrelated and mutually supporting role that all human rights play in this regard. For those of you who joined us a little bit after we started the proceedings this afternoon, I would like to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us during this virtual book launch. For those of you following the program, Professor de Schutter unfortunately couldn't join us this afternoon, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Sandra Liebenberg to speak to us this afternoon. Professor Liebenberg is a distinguished professor and the H.F. Oppenheimer Chair in Human Rights Law at Stellenbosch University, and she's also currently the Vice Chair of the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Professor Liebenberg, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
So thanks very much to you, Dr. Muller, and to all the participants. It is for me a great honor to be invited to celebrate the launch of this book, exploring the link between poverty and human rights in Africa. I want to thank Ebenezer and Gladys, the entire team of authors, the publishers PULP, for gifting us with this invaluable resource on a vital theme. It is also a great honor to share this panel with Judge Collipin, Professor FOMBAD, and I take note of the profound and important contributions that Judge Collipin has just shared with us. So in these few remarks, I intend to share a few reflections on what I see as the important dimensions of examining poverty and human rights in Africa through the lens of human rights. The four dimensions that I will highlight in my remarks are firstly normative, secondly contextual, thirdly institutional, and finally methodological. I will also elaborate on how I see the various chapters in this book speaking to these four dimensions. And then I will conclude with a few remarks on future directions for research on the theme of poverty and human rights that the authors have got us down the road of. So turning to the first dimension, what does it mean to see poverty and human rights through a human rights lens? And the first implication is a normative one. It is to acknowledge that human rights embody our most fundamental values and interests that it should enjoy priority and heightened protection in law and poverty. They are founded on the fundamental values of human dignity, equality, and freedom, alongside important indigenous values such as Ubuntu. And these should really serve as the bedrock of our efforts to evaluate and monitor human rights. But these are, of course, very broad normative concepts, and we need to develop their content and give them concrete expression in various contexts. And that's what happens through national constitutions, through regional human rights instruments such as the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, as well as international human rights treaties, and how these are interpreted through both formal and informal channels. And in so doing, the rights acquire meaning and become hopefully a lived reality in the different contexts in which they operate. So in the specific context of Africa, which this book is concerned about, the preamble of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights notes that the struggle for human rights in Africa is inextricably bound up in the struggles of African peoples against colonial domination, neo-colonialism, and apartheid. And in this regard, I found the chapter by Bright and Krumer, Locating Human Rights within the African Normative and Institutional Framework, particularly instructive. Furthermore, the chapter by Olubayo Oluduru on the links between environmental pollution and poverty elaborates on another very important normative feature of the African Charter, which is its unique status as a human rights instrument protecting the right to a healthy environment necessary for people's development in Article 24 of the chapter. So given the enormous implications of environmental degradation, climate change for poverty, this is indeed a very important contribution. In her chapter, Ms. Mabana Maweso also helps us locate the content of a specific human right, namely the right to water, within the context of the lived realities of women in Africa, as she explores how the right to water should be developed to include the right of water for food production, and highlights its critical relevance for the lived realities of African women. So turning from the normative implications of human rights to the contextual dimension, this is another very important dimension of a human rights-based approach. As our Constitutional Court noted in the famous Grootboom judgment, rights must be interpreted in their historical and social context. And this requires a deep appreciation of the political, economic, social, and cultural context, which generates the kind of structural human rights problems that Judge Collipin alluded to in his remarks. So a number of chapters in this book delve into this context of poverty and inequality in Africa. I think specifically here of the chapters by Sekere, Gordon, Pinar, and Nanya Bola Muller. The contextual opportunities which are available to address the poverty of older persons in Africa are highlighted in Kitty Mulhaber's chapter. And Patrick Bond's chapter, which explores the dynamics of neoliberal economic policy, corruption, and the dynamics of social resistance thereto, is another example in this book of the detailed contextual analysis needed to understand the political and economic forces which fuel poverty and inequality. The third dimension I will highlight of a human rights approach is the institutional one. And this relates to the kinds of accountability mechanisms available to address violations of human rights arising from poverty. Norms without accountability are mere aspirations and are not enforceable rights. So in short, people must have access to effective remedies if their human rights are violated. In this regard, the chapters by Victoria Balogun on access to justice for rural communities in Africa, and by Rachel Adams on the accountability function of FOMBAD institutions such as the South African Human Rights Commission, help explore this important dimension of how to attain accountability for human rights norms in Africa. The regional and international remedies available for intersectional discrimination, experienced particularly by people living with disabilities in Africa, is well explored in Enoch Chilemba's insightful chapter. The final dimension I will highlight in my remarks concerns the key elements of a human rights methodology in the context of poverty eradication. So a human rights-based approach insists on certain cross-cutting principles that should guide strategies and policy processes to overcoming poverty and inequality. These principles include the centrality of people's participation, transparency of policy making, non-discrimination, respect for the principles of the interdependence of all categories of human rights, and respect for the rule of law. The application of these principles in a variety of contexts are explored in nntlama's chapter on gender equality and poverty in the Southern African context, Julian May's chapter on addressing food security through national plans and budgets, as well as the overarching introductory chapter by Gladys Mukundi and Ebenezer Durojaye. So in conclusion, this collection of essays, as I hope that I've demonstrated, really helps to illuminate a number of important dimensions of the linkages between human rights and poverty in Africa. Now, inevitably, this is a very large subject, and it would be unrealistic and unfair to expect all dimensions to be covered in a single volume. Themes that come to mind in this context that this volume could not address include the multiple conflict situations in Africa and the impact this has on human rights and poverty, the debt burden of many African states, including odious debt, the responsibility of the international community to contribute to sustainable development in Africa, resource extraction by multinational corporations, Africa's burden of disease, and of course, going forward, the impact of the COVID pandemic, the devastating impact it is having and will have going into the future for human rights and poverty eradication in Africa. Moreover, if I could sound a small note of gentle criticism, I would add that many of the chapters are still specifically focused on the Southern African and specifically the South African context. This is by no means intended to detract from the unquestionable value of the book. I would rather see this as an invitation to the editors and to PULP to consider working on a series of books on human rights and poverty in Africa, which addresses the contextual specificities of the different regions in Africa, as well as various themes that it was not possible to address within the scope of this book. For now, though, we must take this opportunity to celebrate this important milestone in scholarship on a neglected theme. I express the sincere hope that the research and deep insights in this edited collection will lead to governments and other actors taking human rights more seriously in their efforts to overcome poverty and inequality. By complying with human rights norms and methods, we ensure that people and their needs and their voices are placed at the center and not at the periphery of poverty eradication efforts. I thank you for this opportunity to address you.
Thank you very much, Professor Liebenberg. I really do appreciate the time and effort you took by delineating the frameworks or the frames through which we could approach this theme, for making the links clear between poverty and various human rights, as well as linking your frames identified to the specific chapters that you have identified. I think it's important not only to celebrate the work, but also to focus on how we can take this forward. So thank you also for articulating the topics that could have been included and perhaps should form part of future work in this field. We also do appreciate your constructive criticism of the manuscript. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce the editors of this monograph to you. First is Professor Durojaye, who is a professor of law as well as the head of the Socioeconomic Rights Project at the Dalla Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape, who edited this book with Ms. Mirugi-Mukundi, who's a senior researcher in the same project at the University of the Western Cape. I believe I have it right that Ms. Mirugi-Mukundi will speak on behalf of the editors. So thank you very much, Gladys. I hand over to you.
Thank you, Gustav. Good evening, everyone. The journey to the book began in 2011, and the book was published in 2019-2020. It began when the Dalla Omar Institute was commissioned to give technical assistance to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. The technical assistance was to gather information from Africa that would contribute towards identifying key challenges to the full enjoyment of human rights for people living in extreme poverty, as well as to identify efficient measures to promote these rights. In addition to offering technical assistance to the Special Rapporteur, we were also commissioned to organize a two-day colloquium on poverty and human rights in Africa, which we did organize on the 27th, 28th of November in 2014 in Cape Town. The colloquium was an opportunity for African researchers, development agencies, legal practitioners, as well as community activists to share evidence-based knowledge and experiences on how human rights violations drive and deepen poverty in Africa. The objectives of the colloquium were very simple. There were just three main objectives, very focused to assess the impact of poverty on vulnerable and marginalized groups. Secondly, to explore the nexus between poverty and the enjoyment of socioeconomic rights. And thirdly, to discuss the importance of access to justice in addressing poverty in Africa. The colloquium had a diverse group of participants, including scholars, human rights practitioners, national policymakers, and representatives from regional and multilateral development agencies. According to the participants of the colloquium, widespread poverty and lack of coherent responses by government often translate into inadequate provision of basic services such as access to healthcare, water, sanitation, housing, and education. We would like to thank all the participants of that colloquium. We are grateful to Ford Foundation South Africa for generously providing the financial support towards that colloquium. The papers that were presented at that colloquium were at a later stage developed into book chapters. And I think this is where Dr. Muller can attest that is quite a process, being the shepherd of this book from the beginning to see to the publication of it. In the foreword of the book, Commissioner Jasmina King, chairperson of the Working Group on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, acknowledges that extreme poverty in Africa poses a serious challenge to the realization of economic and social well-being. She emphasizes that extreme poverty in Africa is also as a result of government failures to adopt appropriate policies and programs that will meet the needs of the people, and as well as poor implementation of poverty reduction programs. So initially, there were 17 chapters submitted for consideration. And we eventually published 12 chapters addressing diverse issues, but divided into 4 main themes: trends and incidences of poverty in Africa, secondly, poverty and socioeconomic rights, poverty and vulnerable groups, as well as poverty and access to justice. All of this trying to link as much as possible and trying to review in depth what are the effects of poverty on these specific sectors. While this book focused on the link between poverty and human rights, it does not feature Francophone or Lusophone speaking countries in Africa. And as Professor Liebenberg has put it, I suppose this is also a future consideration for the volumes that will come. This is a first volume, so the future volumes will perhaps cover Francophone and Lusophone countries in Africa. So what is the significance of this book? Apart from adopting a multidisciplinary approach, that's a right-based approach and sociological perspective to addressing poverty, this book places human rights principle at its core. This is a significant contribution to the debate on poverty and human rights in the continent. It's premised on the fact that African governments are responsible for adopting policies and programs that will prevent poverty in their countries. This book would seem to resonate with the approach of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, to promote and protect human and people's rights, as well as address poverty in Africa. Contributors to this book have various backgrounds. They are academic as well as practitioners with social science and legal backgrounds. And this enriches the content of the book. We hope that this book will stimulate debate and scholarship regarding link between poverty and human rights in Africa. We are hoping that researchers, policymakers, students, institutions, civil society groups, as well as activists will find this book useful in their work. We would like to thank the authors for their contribution, for their patience throughout the publication process. We would like to thank the editorial board and anonymous reviewers under the Pretoria University Law Press, under PA, and especially Dr. Muller and Lisette for shepherding the book, the conceptualization to the publication, and their patience. We also want to thank all the participants of this launch. We are hoping that you read the book and give us feedback as we prepare for the next publication. I also want to thank Dola Omar Institute and the colleagues at the Institute for their patience. As you know, publishing a book takes time, but it's also there's a lot of team effort from everyone. And with those few remarks, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mirugi-Mukundi, speaking on behalf of the editors of this manuscript. Thank you for taking us along with you on the journey. I did not appreciate that this journey started in 2011. Thank you for highlighting the themes for us and also alerting us to the space that this book is taking up, not only in the South African, but also in the African context. I think it's worthwhile to emphasize the multidisciplinary approach that this book took. Just coming back to the history, the run-up to the publication of this book, this reminds me of a Tanzanian expression, I believe, which goes something like this: kidogo, kidogo, kidogo cha goika king, which roughly translated means little by little, a little becomes a lot. And so this journey since 2011, working with the papers, working with the idea and the workshop, has little by little become quite a lot and has manifested in not only this edition, but hopefully, as Professor Liebenberg suggested, a few volumes going forward. I then welcome everyone again who has perhaps joined us a little bit late. Thank you for joining us for this virtual launch. It's a great pleasure to host you. With that, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Professor Ntlama, who is one of the authors of one of the chapters in this book. Professor Ntlama is a professor of law and I believe at the time of writing the book, the acting head of the Department of Public Law at the University of Fort Hare. Professor Ntlama, over to you, and thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muller. Can you colleagues hear me? Okay. Thank you very much, colleagues. Let me take this opportunity and pass my regards to our program director for this afternoon, Justice Kolapen, colleagues from Dula Uma, and the editorial team, and also the publishers. Ladies and gentlemen, let me greet you. As an author or a contributor to the book, I'm actually very thrilled to have been a part of the team that made this significant contribution to the production of this book. Because when the call was made for the book and saw the title of the book, which was an eye catcher for me, it generated some butterflies on my stomach, because when I look at issues of bad and human rights, with poverty as well falling under the cluster or the category of socioeconomic rights, I saw an opportunity that I could make a contribution to the book, so that we look at how, for example, the theory, as Judge Kolapen had already indicated earlier on, how theory translates into practice, because we have all these beautiful laws which at face value, they look very progressive, but in terms of their translation, in addressing all the socioeconomic ills that bedevil the citizenry, then it becomes a challenge. So these, the chapters, as also they have just been mentioned, that they are interdisciplinary, and being interdisciplinary, they are also interlinked, and they are focused as well, that they are grounded on the approach, of which the right approach as well, wherein their point of departure is on equality, because equality is not only about the protection and respect for the law, but it requires the benefit of the law. So to have your paper, to have your rights on paper, and also not those rights translated into reality, they actually undermine that last segment of the equality principle, of that which entails the benefit of the law. So with the benefit of the law is of significance in addressing those challenges that people are faced with. And also being involved in the book as well, it also talked to my area of interest, which is constitutional law and human rights, wherein the two areas, I would say, they are foundational to all other areas of the law, because without analyzing what the Constitution says in response to human rights law, then I think we are doomed. As I've just said, that equality is foundational to address all those socioeconomic issues that people are faced with. And we will consider the impact of socio-economic delivery that impacts, for example, on the most vulnerable group, such as women and children. So the book comes at that opportune moment to address those issues.
I can learn to understand you much better if I can get familiar with the way you talk. I need your permission to help.
Hello, colleagues.
Yes, Professor Ntlama, we can hear you.
Okay, I just got a message that I don't talk well. Okay, can I proceed, colleagues?
You are welcome to proceed, Professor Ntlama.
Okay, it's fine. So as I was saying, all the chapters are grounded on equality. For example, the highly celebrated African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and also with its reference to the Protocol on Women, and the recent adoption of the 2063 agenda is an indication of the aspirations of Africa in addressing the issues of human rights, which maybe for women is a good start. But the question still remains, how does that translate into women's fulfillment of their rights? And also, so with the link of the chapters, as I've said, as much as they are grounded on equality, all the chapters, they took an approach of a rights approach, wherein it requires that whatever circumstances that needs to be addressed, they need a rights lens, wherein the language of rights has to talk in addressing the issues that are faced by people. So, in conclusion, I must express that you know, with the dawn of COVID-19, the books is actually addressing some of the, in fact, many of the fundamentals that are faced by people today, because you will notice that COVID-19 exposed the many deep social and structural inequalities that that took time for many governments as well to address. So now our governments have been exposed in terms of strategies that have been in place to deal with issues of emergency like COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ntlama. Thank you very much for taking us on your personal journey and the inspiration for why you became involved with this project. Thank you also for alerting us to the fact that equality has this dual function in the South African constitutional law of a foundational value, but also as a constitutional right, and that there is yet much to be done to realize equality for the most vulnerable in our society. It gives me great pleasure then to introduce our final panel member before we open up the floor for discussion. This is Dr. Nkrumah, who is a researcher in the Global Climate Institute at the University of Witwatersrand. Dr. Nkrumah, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your chapter, and I give the floor to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Gustav. I think the proverb that you cited in Ghana, it is often said, that is, as I said, little by little, a chicken will drink water. And I just saw on the participant list that there are some high-profile personalities that I need to thank. I can't cite all of them, but at least let me just say send my warm greetings to Professor Haynes, Professor Diletradi, Professor Franz as well, Professor FOMBAD, Lizette, Adema Bebe, and so many others. I hope maybe you could have gotten the opportunity to meet in a normal colloquium where we can just have a chat and then maybe have a cocktail. But of course, thanks to COVID, we can't do all those things. But I first met Ebenezer in 2012 at the Center for Human Rights when he first proposed the idea that he's coming up with an unedited collection, whether I'll be interested. So he actually asked me to send an abstract on the topic in terms of the African human rights system in addressing poverty. Initially, I didn't know what to do because by then I was only a master's student. So that was when Magnus proposed that there's a Bible that one needs to consult, because of course you can never write about the African human rights system without you consulting international human rights law in Africa, written by France. So that was the Bible, the Golden Book. So I actually consulted that book, and then I had some difficulties along the way. Then I went to France, who actually held my hand through the process. And at one point, I actually asked him, Franz, why don't you become a co-author since you are playing such an instrumental role? And then he said, no, I don't want to be an honorable author. And to me, I think that was very reputable, something which I actually held in high esteem for that. But the question now is that since that time, so every time it's been almost like getting to a decade now. So the question is that has this time duration, has it make the book outdated? Is it useful in this particular time? I mean, over 10 years. Of course, the book is never outdated. I think it's an opportune time for the book to come out, simply because I think humanity has not seen such enormous amount of poverty and deprivation as the year 2020, which commenced with COVID, where millions have been laid off work. Many who are working in restaurants are now without jobs. Those street, car guards, and there is no one to actually go park their car. So it's like poverty deprivation has now become. I think the year 2020 marks, the epicenter, or the year where millions of people have actually been, deprived of their livelihood. So I think the timing, the delay, I think it had a purpose, and the purpose was for us to come and respond to what is going on at the moment. So the question is, what lessons can this book actually provide with these contemporary times? There are so many chapters which speak to the question of poverty, or who is a poor person. And normally when we speak of poverty, we speak in abstract terms. We are speaking of somebody who lives under 30 rand per day. That means that according to the UN, that means that the person is poor. Now, if you look around us, I think most of us speaking now, we are in South Africa. If you look around us, if you look around you, how many people are living on a 30 rand per day? Initially, the government came up with a social grant, or for unemployed persons, of which many people actually did not get this kind of fund grant. And actually, the proposal was that everyone was going to get 350 per month. And if you strike this 350 by 30, it means that each person is going to get 12 rand. Which translates, and then if you look at the number of those who applied, millions applied, and of course millions were rejected. So it means that you have so many people, millions of people who are actually very poor. But the question is that, does the state have the capacity, does it have the resources to actually provide more than 30 rand per person per day? Perhaps some might say maybe the current crisis has actually crushed the state to the extent that it needs to shift all resources to health issues. But if one should be frank and then look at the COVID premiere, which is going on, there is to some extent so one can make an argument that the resources are there, but as Judge Kwalipan said, is the question of prioritizing. Where do those resources go? So this brings us to the cardinal question, as to the question of the book chapter. How can that African human rights system address poverty? And of course, as Professor Liebenberg said, that there are so many normative frameworks which speak to poverty, and there are about 3 institutions which are actually mandated to address questions relating to poverty. But are these institutions used? Are they being utilized? Do these normative frameworks, do they actually translate into practice? And I think that's something that actually Prof. Villion addresses speaks about in his book. It's like moving from rhetorics to reality. To what extent can we translate these normative frameworks into practice? How can we use them to actually fight or to actually get redress for the poor? And that's something that actually the book speaks to, that there are so many people who are actually, they have no idea that there are certain instruments which exist that they can actually resort to in order to actually litigate or better their lives. So, how can we bring them on board? Because a poor person is not the advocate who frequents Addis. The poor person is normally not the advocate who goes to the Constitutional Court. No, the researcher who actually almost every day writes about human rights. The poor person is that woman who is actually, as we speak now, is carrying firewood in Onitsha. The poor person is actually the person who is actually tilling his land in the plains of Kumasi, and that person does not even know that there is a law, or there is an institution where I can actually go and ask my government to help me. So this brings us to a very discursive question. How can we utilize these institutions? Because otherwise they become dormant. It means that perhaps we need to consider 2 options. And that's something I think the book to some extent sheds light on. That is awareness creation. We need to let the people understand, or let the people know, advocacy, that there is a law, and then you need to consult, or maybe there's a law that one can actually seek, remedy from. And also it's very important that human rights activists, we don't just speak, but we actually seek the help of advocates, of lawyers, of public interest litigators, who can actually translate our voices into actions. Because ultimately, a lawyer will not by him or herself rise up and say, I'm going to litigate, I'm going to fight for people's right to food, I'm going to fight for people's right to social grant. I believe most advocates would like to be approached, and approaching an attorney normally comes with fees, of which the poor people cannot actually afford, because after the first priority is to get money for bread. Why must I now go take the money to go and pay an attorney to go and fight my case, which can actually be prolonged? So there is a need for better collaboration between human rights activists, the poor themselves, and legal practitioners, in order to ensure that the various elements of the human rights system comes to light. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nkrumah, for your observations. Thank you again to you for, like Professor Ntlama, explaining your journey for becoming involved with this project and expressing or articulating your interest in the broad theme. But also thank you for speaking directly about the Banjul Charter and linking up to the comments that Professor Liebenberg made. Thank you also for your call to action to turn the texts we work with as human rights instruments into reality. Colleagues, this brings us to the end of our panel discussion. And just before we open up the floor to discussion to our virtual audience this afternoon, I'm going to ask Tiruna to put up our second and our last poll for the afternoon, while I just put up the ground rules for the discussion. I think we have around 20 minutes for a general discussion. So I'm going to ask all our panel members to please just switch on your video so that the audience can get a good, nice look at you. For those who would like to pose a question, I encourage you to please switch on your video, and then I will prompt you to pose your question. When I do so, may I please just ask that you just briefly introduce yourself, perhaps your name and surname, and where you are contacting us from. And if you are directing your question to a particular panel member, that you do so too. I know that Judge Kalapin had to leave us, unfortunately, before the close of proceedings, because he had a prior engagement. So perhaps we won't be able to take or direct questions to Judge Kalapin. So with those rules or those guidelines, humble requests, could I perhaps see or get an indication whether there is a question to any one of our panel members at this point in time? You're also welcome to post that question you have in the chat box. I can perhaps then read that. And while we are waiting for a question, we kindly invite you to answer the questions if you like and participate in our poll. Right. I don't see any questions coming through as of yet. So perhaps just another invitation. Please don't be shy. We welcome any questions from the audience at this point in time. If we don't get any questions at this point in time, perhaps I can ask Professor Ebenezer Durojaye if he would like to speak as one of the editors at this point in time.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Muller. I don't have much to say, as my colleague has already said much about the book and the journey to the book. But just also to thank all the authors that participated in the book, and of course the role played by PULP. And one other important thing, which Professor, I also need to really thank Professor Sandra Liebenberg. You know, for most of all that don't know, she was the pioneer head of the Socio-Economic Crime Project long time ago at the then Community Law Center before the change of name to the Durojaye Institute. Before she left for Stellenbosch University, but her heart seems to be with the project. She has continued to support us in various ways. She has been so generous and kind. But to Sandy Liebenberg, we are very grateful for that. And we were already considering the suggestion you made about the fact that in a book talking about poverty and human rights, we cannot be exhaustive. And so Gladys and I have had that conversation, and we're also thinking of proposing a subsequent edition of the book, looking at other issues that were not addressed, which you raised, and some other which we have already identified as well, to be a follow-up edition to this edition. So we're very grateful for your suggestion. So we also thank you very much for your support all the time. And we're hoping that this will just stimulate debates about the link between poverty and human rights generally in Africa. And we'll also be very grateful for feedback from people who have read and who have anything to say about that. We also take note of the fact that it's a bit focus on one region more than the other, and that's also part of the reason why we thought that a follow-up edition will be more representative in terms of issues and in terms of sub-region in Africa. So I think for now, to thank everyone, Professor Franz Villon was also very, very instrumental to the book. We are grateful for his support. I think I also like to thank Professor Charles Ngwena, who was also of the same human rights. He was my supervisor for doctorate, and from there we have continued to collaborate as co-authors and do some projects together. So I think I would like to thank you for his support over the years. So perhaps that's where I need to say something for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Durojaye, for your few comments and for also putting this into context. Since we have Professor Liebenberg here, perhaps I can abuse my position as chair and ask her a question about how I think Judge Gulapan mentioned the test of reasonableness review and minimum core obligations, and in your perhaps not your official position as vice chair of the United Nations Committee, but how you see the use of the reasonableness review test, and perhaps a renewed energy about the minimum core obligation playing a role in this debate about poverty and linking that to human rights. Just your microphone. Yeah. There we go.
So thank you for that question, Dr. Muller. So I think the role of the minimum core, as everyone knows, it's very much part of the UN Committee's understanding of a flaw of all the economic, social, and cultural rights in the covenant. The optional protocol, which establishes our justiciability mechanisms, also has a reasonableness paradigm. We have it expressly in Article 8.4 of the optional protocol, but in our jurisprudence thus far, we integrate the minimum core obligation very much in our reasonableness review jurisprudence. So we basically generally find that if states do not prioritize basic provision for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged, it's likely to be found to be unreasonable in terms of the optional protocol. I think what is also important difference between the jurisprudence of the committee and the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court is that the committee has quite an elaborate development of what the full realization of the rights entail. So not only the minimum core, but what does it mean to say you have a right to adequate housing? You know, what are the core elements that one would need to look at, or the right to education or water? So that sort of normative development, I think, is something which I do believe the committee's jurisprudence could be useful to the Constitutional Court. And I also see signs in the emerging jurisprudence of the African Court as well as the Commission of developing the substantive content of socioeconomic rights. I just think it's really important not to say that the whole content of socioeconomic rights is a minimum core. I think that is a starting point, but ultimately we want everyone to have an adequate standard of living that is consistent with human dignity, and that is what we should be aiming to. So that's what I would contribute on that particular question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Liebenberg. Yes, I found your expression of the specific characteristics of the right of access to adequate housing, or perhaps the characteristics that would be indicative of education or access to water, can really help to express how the progressive realization of those rights work. Let me just go to the chat function over here. I would just like to note, I think Amadou Tarne from Cameroon, if you indicated that you would like to make a contribution. If you are still with us, you are welcome to turn on your microphone and perhaps just alert us to whom you would like to address the question. Amadou, we can't hear you, unfortunately.
Yes,
yes.
I hear me.
Wonderful, thank you. Please pose your question.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be part of this training program today. So, not like the question, it's just like let me just say a comment with regard to something that was said by the judge. So, but he was trying to say that the non-respect of some of our rights has led to the issue of poverty, and he cited particularly, I'm referring particularly to the rights of education. I think here in Africa, most of the problem that we are suffering today is not, we cannot link it to the right of education, or maybe it could only be to an extent that it could be right of education that has been violated, that has led us to be suffering. Because we have a lot of Africans who have gone to school, but they are unable to find jobs. So this one particularly is not because we have not been to school, but simply because the institution or the educational system are too poor. Like particularly here in Cameroon, our educational system are too poor that we have graduates who are unable to create a job for themselves. They are unable to know the available opportunities or to be job creators instead of being relying on someone or the government to employ them. So I just wanted to say that the issue of poverty with regards to education cannot only get to a lesser extent can be linked to the issue of the non-respect of the rights of education. And just in that perspective, I don't know if you understand me well. Hello?
Yes, thank you very much. We heard you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment or your remark about the link between poverty and education. Let me just go back to the chat function over here. I see Rufaz Mavure thanks us for the presentation and makes the comment that African activists mostly link poverty to political mismanagement of economies. Rufaz, if you are still with us and you would like to perhaps elaborate on this point, you are welcome to switch on your microphone and your video, and perhaps elaborate on your thoughts that you expressed there. Rufaz, are you still with us? Doesn't seem to be. Then Siyabulela Fobosi thanks us for the presentation and asks, what are your thoughts about human rights violations amidst the COVID-19 pandemic? I think one or two of the panelists mentioned this. Professor Nkrumah linked to that, perhaps. Dr. Nkrumah, while you are with us, since you spoke about that very briefly, could I perhaps ask you whether you have any more thoughts about the link between human rights violations and the COVID-19 pandemic? And then obviously other panel members are welcome to speak to that topic as well. Dr. Nkrumah?
Thank you, Professor Gustav. So in terms of human rights and human rights and COVID, I think at the moment Professor Ebenezer is actually coming up even with an edited volume on the same issue, which he is actually trying to see. But we did the context of constitutional resilience, and then but if we link it to poverty at this of which this book is about, you can see that to some extent Africa has been a land of a land of the poor, because if you trace it from the 1960s, you can see that the continent had a promising future, but then from the 1980s coming down to the 2000s, that is when economic mismanagement and dictatorship and conflict actually destabilized our GDP, which in the 60s used to be actually higher than it used to be higher than the Asian continent. So there were millions who were actually deeply grounded in poverty. But then the COVID has actually made it very, very worse. And then if I should give you a practical example, in my village in Anamabu, there is you have a woman who has been running a crèche for the past 20 years. And due to COVID, now the crèche has been shut down. And the government's intervention was to bring 5 fingers of plantain and palm oil for the last 4 months. That's all that she has actually gotten from the government. And so, considering that this is a person who has about 4 or 5 dependents, a widow, how is this person supposed to cater for her dependent? And in the same way, in Abeokuta, a colleague of mine told me that he actually just received 5 kilograms of gari. When you see this state of deprivation and frustration, and maybe if you should just draw the intersection or the link between how things were before March and how things are now, you can actually see the huge gap in people's standard of living. So to a greater extent, there was poverty, but now it has gone beyond that. It has gone. I don't know how to even contextualize it, but it's worse now, especially for those who were actually running their own personal businesses. So that is why it is imperative that actually the government, of which we know, or it is within the public domain, that many governments have actually approached the IMF for loan to actually come and support the economy. But the question is, do these loans that the government actually access, does it trickle down to the ordinary person on the ground? It's a very controversial issue. And I think that's something which is beyond the scope of this book. And I wouldn't want to delve into that. But so indeed, to a greater extent, the COVID has actually made, crisis or socioeconomic rights very, very, it has actually violated many people's socioeconomic rights. And somebody just spoke about education, which now it's clear that many people can actually graduate, talk of going to look for jobs. So the unemployed, whose hopes of actually securing a means of survival, now those hopes have been dashed. So to a greater extent, there is a massive amount of state of poverty in this current regime. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Nkrumah. Colleagues, I'm mindful of our time and that we have already run out of time. So I just want to acknowledge that we have 1 or 2 more questions in the chat function. Perhaps I could encourage those colleagues that pose the questions in the chat function to direct those questions to the Facebook pages of the Center for Human Rights, where this is being live streamed, or the Facebook page of the Pretoria University Law Press. And perhaps we can continue this conversation off air. For the moment, I'm going to ask Tiruna to put up the results or the answers for the poll that we did, the second poll, and you are welcome to scroll through that at your own leisure. Perhaps I can just speak to or alert you to one or two of the answers here. So the first question, in your opinion, which issues currently affect poverty and human rights in Africa? And from the results, it seems that the actions or inactions of government came up top of the poll. And perhaps the third question, in your opinion, what was the most valuable aspect of the virtual book launch? The feedback was, I'm now inspired to read this book. Well, that is decidedly a most sterling outcome and good feedback about the book. Colleagues, I want to start wrapping up the proceedings. So let me start by alerting you to the fact that the first issue of the 2020 edition of the African Human Rights Law Journal was recently published, and it contains a book review of exploring links between poverty and human rights in Africa. I think there is a link to this book review right at the top of this chat, so I encourage you, if you are interested in reading the book, please also read the book review. I think what bears to say for me at this point is to thank our panel members a last time, to Professor FOMBAD, to Judge Kalapan, who's already left, unfortunately, to Professor Liebenberg, to Professor Durojaye, Ms. Mirugi-Mukundi, Professor Ntlama, and Dr. Nkrumah. Thank you very much for making yourself available. Thank you for your insights, thank you for your challenges, and thank you for your inspirational perspectives. I also want to congratulate the editors at this point in time for this monumental step that they've taken, for the courage that they've displayed over the past few years, and to the authors for contributing to this project. I also want to thank the back office that made this virtual book launch possible. I want to thank Lizette Herman, Yolanda Boysen, Liesel Hager, and Tiruna Naidu for ably assisting me behind the screens to bring you this first and historic virtual book launch for the Pretoria University Law Press. I'm also thankful and deeply appreciative to the audience that joined us, not only from South Africa, but Africa and further afield. I think I saw Professor Penelope Andrews joining us. If my recollection is correct, she joined us from the United States. So thank you very much to her. Colleagues, at this time, thank you from my side. On behalf of the Pretoria University Law Press, the Center for Human Rights, and the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria for joining in this afternoon. Thank you for your time. Please continue this conversation offline by liking and sharing the videos on the Facebook pages of the Center for Human Rights and the Pretoria University Law Press. I think with that, this brings us to the close of our proceedings, and I wish you all a very good evening if you're from this time zone, or a very good morning. I hope you have a wonderful day. Alternatively, have a very good night, and thank you.